The oldest question in photography is, what camera should I buy? Alright, it's not really the oldest question, it's probably what the hell is photography. But one very common question that I see people asking is, what camera should I buy? Now, I did a video on this about 18 months ago. The basic conclusion is, it's entirely up to you. There is no right or wrong answer. If there was such thing as a right camera or a wrong camera, everyone would use the same thing. It comes down to personal preference, what you're using the camera for, and how much you've got to spend as well. Now, the last video that I did basically just covered the 4 common types of camera: compact, bridge, mirrorless, and DSLR. But since then, quite a bit's changed. We've seen new smartphones come out with improved cameras. We've seen sales of smartphones increase more and more, while sales of cameras dropping more and more. We've seen manufacturers releasing swarms of new mirrorless gear, but very few DSLR, and the technology within the cameras has started to change quite a bit as well. So maybe it's time to update the video. So along with updating the compact, bridge, mirrorless, and DSLRs from the last video, we're also going to add in smartphones and action cameras as well. So let's start off with smartphones, because let's be honest, smartphones are the most popular way today of people taking pictures. The world population takes more photos in a single second on a smartphone than they do on cameras in an entire day, I imagine. Now, there's no doubt that with this massive popularity for people taking pictures on smartphones, the phone manufacturers are really starting to push the tech more and more. But no matter how much the marketing department of smartphone companies pushes how great the cameras are, there are some realistic limitations that need to be remembered. First and foremost is the size of the sensor. The sensors on smartphones are pretty bloody small, when you consider that right there are 2 camera units that take up less space than the APS-C sensor found in this Sony a6500. Now, that's not to say you can't take pictures with a phone, because clearly you can, but once you start to lose light, once you get into lower light scenarios, that's where small sensors becomes a problem. There is only one advantage truly to smartphones, and that's convenience. Because not everyone has a camera, but pretty much everyone has a smartphone. Which means you always have a way of taking pictures right on hand at any time. You don't have to worry about taking an extra camera. But a smartphone never truly replaces a camera. It's just a more convenient alternative. In exactly the same way as I can process the images and I can browse the web and I can play games all on my phone. But I couldn't do it as well as I can on my computer. But I'm not going to carry a computer around with me everywhere I go. Now let's move on to action cameras. Now, action cams really got spearheaded by the likes of GoPro, but there are so many more cheaper alternatives on the market now. Their original design was all for sports, action, hence the name. They were very small, they were very lightweight, so you could fit them onto things like your helmet or a bike or whatever it was you were doing. And usually they came with a reinforced protective case, usually a waterproof case as well. But I see so many people these days buying action cameras for taking stills and videos, not of action. Never go anywhere near action, but they still buy it just because it's really small to carry around. And that is true, they are, but there are some drawbacks. The first most noticeable is in shrinking down the size and weight of the entire camera means shrinking down the size and weight of the battery. As a result, the battery life of action cameras is never particularly good. I remember I had the GoPro Hero 3 and the battery life on that lasted all of about 20 minutes when recording video, which was not particularly useful when I went diving, because you can't really change the battery when you're 30 feet underwater. The other problem with action cameras, and is true of most smartphones as well, which I forgot to mention, pretty much all action cameras and most smartphones don't have optical zooms. And by optical zoom, I mean where the glass elements are actually physically moving away from each other to truly magnify the view that's being projected into the camera. Most of them only offer a digital zoom, which is no more than an artificial crop and degrades the quality of the image as well. Now, some new smartphone cameras are starting to see the ability to do optical zoom. Most of them have started to employ this 2 or 3 camera setup so they can have different focal length lenses to cover wide or telephoto. But unfortunately, action cams don't have that luxury, at least none that I am aware of. All the action cams that I can think of have a single fixed lens, and usually a really wide angle one as well, which again is great for sports and action because you want that wide vista. But for general day-to-day photos, a really wide angle lens isn't always ideal. Sometimes you want a more close-up shot, and if you move physically closer, you're going to get some weird looking photos. So the only real advantage of action cams, for me at least, is the versatility of what you can do with them. The fact that they are far more rugged, they can go into far more obscure places. I mean, you wouldn't want to go cycling around with one of these stuck to your head, would you? But they're not really suited for general day-to-day photo and video work. For that, you might want to consider compact. Compact cameras generally have similar size sensors to the smartphones and the action cameras, i.e. not particularly big, so work fine in good light, but not so good in dark light, dark light, dark light, dark light. The big advantage to compact cameras, however, is that you get a pretty decent optical zoom. The camera bodies are generally no bigger than this, usually a bit smaller as well, but the lens is incorporated into the body and it extends out when you power the camera on. Now, most compact cameras with small sensors generally offer a pretty versatile zoom range. You can get some high-end compact cameras with bigger sensors, but they generally then have a more limited zoom range. But for subjects that are close to you, particularly with budget-level compact cameras, there's not really that much of a difference. But when I say shooting things at long distance, you generally think sport, wildlife, things that are really far away from you and generally moving quite quickly. But compact cameras aren't really best suited for that. Firstly, because the autofocus systems on them aren't really the best for capturing fast action stuff. But more importantly, the lenses aren't really suited to it either. Because while they might have a half decent zoom range, they might not have as long as you need for really far away subjects, and the apertures on them will be really restrictive as well. So what about bridge cameras? Well, bridge cameras basically took compact to the next level. They essentially were to bridge the gap between the small compact cameras and the bigger DSLRs. They gave you a body that looked more like a DSLR, and they gave you a longer zoom range to go with it. But like the compact cameras, the lens is incorporated into the body, so isn't able to be changed. Bridge cameras are very similar to compact in that you get some low-end ones with small sensors and you can get higher-end ones with bigger sensors. Really, the big difference between the compact and the bridge cameras is the bigger body of the bridge camera allows for a bigger lens. So you'll get a much longer zoom range and probably a slightly faster aperture as well. But they are still going to struggle with high ISO shooting, so are still not necessarily going to be particularly well suited to sports or wildlife, where even in good daylight sometimes you need to bump your ISO up if you're trying to get a fast shutter speed. So smartphones, action cams, compact and bridge have some differences and some similarities. The main similarities for me is that in good light, and if you're not going to be zooming in, you're not really going to be pushing the images, all of them do a pretty good job for just taking casual photographs. But if you are going to start stretching things, either shooting in low light, shooting at high ISOs, or cropping in heavily and really pushing those files in editing, then the smaller sensor cameras do start to suffer. This is where we move on to mirrorless and DSLRs. Now, these two are basically why I wanted to update this video, because in the original video I briefly gave the overview that mirrorless and DSLR were fundamentally the same in terms of sensors. Most manufacturers will employ the same sensors in mirrorless and DSLR, so the image quality you get is no different. The only difference is that a mirrorless camera is essentially a DSLR with the mirror removed. So the body can be made smaller and lighter, which may be an advantage if you're traveling, but there are some drawbacks. And the notable drawbacks that I gave was that the camera was then having to rely on the sensor to focus rather than using a separate focusing chip like a DSLR. And the battery life on a mirrorless isn't as good because the camera is having to employ the sensor all the time. It drains the battery a lot faster. Now, the battery life issue still hasn't gone away. Mirrorless cameras haven't changed the way they work. A mirrorless sensored camera is active the moment you switch the camera on. Not only that, it's also then got to power either an LCD screen or an EVF as well. And there's no getting around that because that's the only way that you can see what the image is that you're actually taking. So if you put the exact same battery into a mirrorless camera and a DSLR camera when shooting stills, the DSLR will always outdo the mirrorless. Now, I specify for doing stills because when you're shooting video, a DSLR essentially becomes a mirrorless camera. Because to shoot video, the camera needs to be constantly seeing what's going on. So the mirror moves up and out the way, and then the DSLR becomes an oversized mirrorless camera. But technology is always advancing, so the amount of power that cameras draw is decreasing due to things like more efficient processors. Also, battery technology is improving, so the capacity and the efficiency of batteries is getting better and better. So mirrorless cameras, while they can't last as long as DSLRs, a lot of the higher end ones are able to last as long as you would need a battery to last on a day. The other point I need to address with these two is autofocus. So in the previous video, I summarized that mirrorless cameras were pretty good for autofocus, but DSLRs are better suited for sports and wildlife. And the truth is that that's really starting to shift these days. The technology in sensor-based autofocus nowadays is just insane. And there are several advantages to sensor-based autofocus over the separate AF chips found in DSLRs. But which should you go for, mirrorless or DSLR? That's the common question that I get asked by a lot of people. For me, mirrorless is where the future lies. That's the future-proof way to go would be mirrorless. The big advantage for the DSLR route for me at the moment is the fact that because everyone else is shifting to mirrorless, all the DSLR stuff is now so much cheaper to buy used. You can buy a generation or two old DSLR that is still a really good, capable camera. You know, a camera doesn't suddenly become less capable when a new model comes out. It's just not as capable as the next generation. But for most people taking pictures, a generation or two old DSLR will still be more than sufficient for what you need. And you can pick them up really, really cheap these days. And same with the lenses. And the good thing with investing in DSLR lenses is that they are transferable onto a mirrorless body via an adapter. Granted, you probably won't get the full potential from your new shiny mirrorless camera using DSLR lenses, but it at least allows you a more gradual transition rather than having to just sell everything and buy all new. But regardless, between DSLR or mirrorless, both of them have one big advantage to the other four, in that lenses can be changed. So you can swap and change and fit whatever lens best suits the particular situation that you are shooting in. So hopefully that answers what type of camera you should buy. But ultimately, like I said in the previous video and like I said at the start of this video, which particular camera you go for is entirely personal preference. There is no right or wrong answer. So once you've decided what type of camera fits your needs, then you need to go to a shop, try out the different cameras of that type and see which one feels more comfortable to you. Because you could buy the most all-singing, all-dancing camera on the planet, but if you're not comfortable using it, then it's just going to sit on a shelf gathering dust and you're not actually going to learn anything. So far better to buy a lower end camera that you're comfortable with than a higher end camera that's going to become an expensive paperweight. But that's it for this video, guys. As always, if you have any questions or queries, the comment box is down below. Thank you so much for stopping by, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.